My name is Jim Gibb. This is my co-author, Olivia Williamson. We're from the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center, specifically the Archaeology Lab, and we're talking about variability in the shell button industry in Delmarva in 20th century. Our principal question going in was, why do this work in Delmarva? The industry was already well established in the upper Midwest by the 1890s. They exploited a rich supply of yellow sandshell mussels in the upper Mississippi drainage. And the Chesapeake and Delaware Bays really didn't have much in the way of suitable species for making shell buttons. So, what's the answer to our question? Well, we really don't know yet. We're working on it. But we can look at what's available, and what's available are hard-shell clams and whelks, both of which have suitable material but poor geometries for manufacturing large quantities of shell button blanks. We have other shellfish, we have mussels, oysters, scallops, but they are not suitable for the work. The shells are too thin and irregular. Local clam available in the bays. You can see where blanks have been cut and one that was one attempted cut. You could tell from the size and the geometry of this thing that you can't get very many blanks out of it, and you can't do it very quickly. So it's not an ideal material. On shell button cutting sites, we do find the same species over and over again, although not all the same species at all the sites. We find yellow sandshell. We find pearl oyster from the South Pacific. We find conus top, tooth top shells from tropical waters around the world, and black abalone from the coast of California and Mexico. You can see from these images that you can cut a lot of blanks out of these materials very quickly. Upper left is yellow sandshell, upper right is pearl oyster, a shell that was probably a foot long or more and nearly a foot wide and very thick, so you're cutting plugs out of these things, which could then be split into more button blanks. So it's very productive. The lower left is black abalone, and the lower right, greatly enlarged, is conus top shell. In terms of the factories, Lippincott factory in Milton was among the largest, with over 100 workers, as you could see from this image, white men. There were women working in these factories, but relatively few, mostly secretarial, but also in sorting shells by quality and polishing. There were certainly very few African Americans working in these places, and we don't have good evidence yet, but I'm guessing that it was probably in janitorial positions. A moderate sized factory is this one, the Schwanda button factory in Denton, adaptively reused as county office building. You can see it's opened in 1936, pretty much state-of-the-art industrial architecture, quite out of place actually on the Eastern Shore. On the left-hand side, you can see a wall, and this is part of a wall with a gate that goes around the entire rear part of the complex. You can see it here stippled, the various walls. Embedded in the top of this wall, as you can see in the lower right-hand corner, are whelk shells that had been cut. Button blanks had been produced from them, and the waste cemented into the wall. It's part of the wall. At the base of the wall, we found a lot of shell. What you see here in the upper right-hand corner are mostly yellow sand shell, and they have not been cut. And we think they have not been cut because they are small and thin and just not suitable for blank cut. Here you see one of the whelks, badly weathered, but embedded into the wall, and you can see one button blank, two really, that have been removed. The smaller shops, smaller to medium size, are fairly simple affairs, usually frame buildings with banks of windows on each side, each of the long sides, admitting light and good ventilation. editing shop near Milton, Delaware. And it had a chimney, stove chimney, so it was heated and therefore probably used during cooler weather as well as warmer weather. In front of the building, we dug just 2 shovel test pits and found large deposits of button cutting waste, in this case specifically pearl oyster, from each of those shovel test pits. So there's no doubt it's a shell button cutting shop. Another shop near Vienna, Maryland. Similar design, very simple, banks of windows, which in this case have been replaced. This is now a lodge. We're looking to connect with the owner so we could do some testing around the site, see if we could find some shell button cutting waste and get a good sample of this. And we have the Parizek button cutting shop in Milford, Delaware, which really started this research. It was the first shop we looked at. It's a little different that it's concrete block construction, but it wasn't built till 1940, so it's a few years later than the other shops. Same banks of windows on each side. In this map off to the right, you can see 2 shell waste piles that we've sampled extensively. And if memory serves, the only species we got out of there were pearl oyster and yellow sand shell. Image of the top of one of those shell heaps. In the floor plan, you can see there are 14 workstations. They're all served by a vacuum system represented by the dashed lines that suck up the shell dust at the point where the shell is cut and remove it to an outdoor collection facility. The interior of the shop, recent owners have used it to store household stuff, but they've not molested any of the machinery. You can see all the machines in place. You can see pans of cut button blanks. It looks as if one day everybody went out to lunch and they never came back. So it's beautifully preserved. An example of one of the cutting machines. It's essentially a lathe. There would be a circular saw blade at this end, and the machine is advanced towards the shell, which is held in the left hand of the cutter. And they would just keep drilling out blanks from that shell until the material was exhausted. Interior showing some of the exhaust and belt systems. In the upper right-hand corner, you could see the collection facility for the shell button cutting waste, the dust. And that would have been used for fertilizer and also as an additive for poultry feed. And poultry industry was quite big, and as it still is, on the Eastern Shore. One other shop we've recently found, but there's no building to look at because it was long since razed and is in the middle of an agricultural field, and that's near Denton, Maryland. What on the ground is concentrations of mostly conus top shells in the field, and there's some architectural debris. I mean, you can very clearly see where the shop was, and we were able to systematically collect the waste, map everything in with an instrument, and get a nice sample. This distribution has its problems. The yellow for Edgington down in Milton is all pearl oyster, but it's based on 2 shovel test pits. So there might actually be other species represented there. We won't know until such a time as we're able to do some sampling around the building. There's also a problem with the Schwanda data in that there are no whelks shown in the sample, and that's because they were all cemented into the wall, so we couldn't really pick them up and bring them home. We'd like to get more shops, more samples to start look at distribution. You know, there's our our sample unremovable from the site. So we didn't find what we expected, didn't find what I expected anyway, which is I hypothesized that we would have increasing variability in species throughout the 20th century as certain desired species became less available through overexploitation. But all these sites are more or less contemporaries, and the most variability is shown at the largest site, which is the Schwanda site. And it may well be that they deliberately, at Schwanda, deliberately went and ordered other species to meet specific needs from the clothing manufacturers. They may have required qualities that were present in cone-top shells or potentially even in the whelks that they couldn't get from the others. So our findings to date, again, this is a long-term study. It's multi-generational. Um, it started with Bailey Berry, went on to Sierra Bayuk, and now we're working on it. Expect to be working on it for some time to come. But so far, we see declining variability in shop size. The large shops, the large factories in the 1930s and 40s were really disappearing by the 1950s. Medium-sized shops became relatively more common, and we see the beginning of small shops, one-person jobs, somebody working in a shed or in their barn, or small family operations. And we have some data to indicate that when the larger factories closed, individuals bought machines from them so they can continue the work themselves. In terms of variability in species, because it may peak in the 1950s, but it's not clear that it has to do with declining populations of suitable shell. It may have to do with something very specific about factories ordering particular kinds of shells to meet certain kinds of orders. And we're also looking into the relationship between button blank size and species, work that Alexandra O'Keeffe has done that looks very promising. The whole study falls into, addresses some larger issues of historical interest. What are the effects of rural electrification on industry? Could we have a shell button cutting industry on the Eastern Shore were it not for rural electrification? Are race and gender identities reproduced in the industry? Our preliminary work based on the 1940 census suggests yes, very much so. The 1930 census is of no value because the industry hadn't really taken hold, and the 1950 census will not be released until next year. What happens when a preferred species is no longer available? What does a shop do? What does a company do? And then finally, what may be the most interesting question, how does a community build and maintain an industry in which they have no control over the critical raw material? We hope to have answers in the not too distant future. So again, I mentioned this is a multi-generational project. Bailey Berry started it in 2014. Sierra Bayuk worked on it up into 2018. The date on this reference is wrong. But if you look into the 2018 issue of Northeast Historical Archaeology, you'll see her paper. And again, Alexandria O'Keeffe working on the button size relationship to species. So the project continues, and we look forward to hearing about other sites that you may know of. Thank you.